1 month after the incident, Yuna stood in the common lounge where everything had changed and watched a new couch being installed. This one had been designed differently, with no gaps where curious cubs could become trapped. And the bolts were accessible from above rather than hidden underneath. The Kovani delegation had requested the modification, and the station administrators had agreed without hesitation. "It looks strange," Cerise said from beside her, and his voice held the critical tone of someone who had strong opinions about furniture. "It looks safe," Yuna replied. "That is what Father said." Cerise had become a constant presence in her life over the past weeks, visiting her quarters every day with questions and gifts and the boundless energy of childhood. His mane had begun growing back, and the new fur was coming in slightly darker than before, which the Kovani doctors said was normal after trauma. Yuna's arms had healed more slowly than the cub's pride, but the regenerative therapy had done its work while she could move without pain now, though the doctors warned her that she would never quite regain the full strength she had possessed before the lift. She did not mind strength. She had learned was not measured in what you could lift, but in what you were willing to. Sacrifice Ambassador Thrivak entered the lounge with his guards and paused when he saw Yuna and Cerise examining the new furniture. "I see you are supervising the installation," he said. Cerise wanted to make sure it was properly done. A wise precaution. The ambassador moved to stand beside them, and his presence no longer carried the tension it once had. Something had shifted between them during the past month, and Yuna was not entirely sure what to call it. Friendship felt too simple, an alliance felt too formal, and something in between existed that had no name in any language she knew. "I have received a response from my government," Thrivak said. "Regarding your recommendations?" "Regarding all of it." He produced a datapad and handed it to her with a formality that suggested the contents were significant. Read through the document slowly, and her eyes widened as she reached the central clause. "They want to establish a formal protection pact with humanity?" "They do, based on the fact that I lifted a couch?" Thrivak made a sound that might have been a laugh in a being less dignified. "Based on the fact that you demonstrated a quality my government values above all others." "Which quality?" "Loyalty to the helpless." He took the datapad back and tucked it into his robes. "The Kovani were once a conquered people," he said, "and we remember what it was like to be weak and to have no one willing to fight for us." Yuna had not known this about Kovani history, and she filed the information away for later study. "When I reported what you did, my government understood immediately what it meant," Thrivak continued, "because a species that will break itself to protect a stranger's child is a species that will never abandon an ally in need. That is a lot to conclude from one incident, perhaps, but I have also included the stories." "What stories?" "The human stories of hysterical strength," Thrivak said. "The accounts of your people lifting vehicles and breaking down doors and fighting off attackers, many times their size when someone they cared about was threatened." He looked at her with those amber eyes that had once held only dismissal. "Your species does not know how to give up," he said. "And that is terrifying to contemplate as an enemy, but wonderful to contemplate as a friend." Cerise listening to this exchange with the patient confusion of a child surrounded by adult conversation. "Does this mean human Yuna is part of our pack now?" he asked as Father Thrivak considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "In a way, yes." "Good," Cerise said firmly, "because I already decided that last week." He reached out and took Yuna's hand in his small clawed grip, and the gesture of trust was so absolute that Yuna felt her throat tighten. "The formal signing will take place tomorrow," Thrivak said. "And you have been requested as the human representative." "Me? I am just a cultural attaché. You are the human who proved what your species is capable of," Thrivak corrected. "And my government wishes to honor that by including you in the ceremony." Yuna looked down at Cerise. who was still holding her hand with no intention of letting go. "I would be honored," she said. The ceremony the next day was a simple affair by Corvani standards, which meant it was elaborate by anyone else. Representatives from a dozen species had gathered to witness the signing, and Yuna could feel their eyes on her as she took her place beside Ambassador Threvok. Whispers had not stopped since the incident, and she knew that her name had traveled far beyond this station human who lifted the impossible weight, they called her. And the title made her uncomfortable in ways she could not easily explain. She had not done anything special. She thought she had simply done what any human would do when a child was in danger, but perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the thing that made humans special was not any single act of impossible strength, but the certainty that any human would attempt that act when the moment demanded it. The signing itself was brief, with both representatives pressing their hands to a document that would bind their species in mutual protection. When it was done, Threvok turned to address the gathered witnesses. "Today marks a new chapter in the relationship between the Corvani Empire and humanity," he said. "And it begins not with a treaty negotiated in comfort, but with an act of sacrifice made in desperation." He gestured toward Yuna, and she felt her face flush with embarrassment. "This human showed my people what we had failed to see," Threvok continued. "That strength is not measured in size or claws or the ability to destroy, but in the willingness to be destroyed for the sake of another." The gathered diplomats murmured among themselves, and Yuna could see minds changing in real time. The Delvians who had once avoided humans were now looking at her with something like respect and Morthani. Traders were calculating new possibilities. Even the small Veth seemed to stand a little taller in her presence. "I have a gift for you," Threvok said. Turning to face Yuna directly, he reached into his robes and produced a small medallion on a chain, and the design showed a figure lifting a weight beneath a sky full of stars. "This is the Corvani Medal of the Guardian," he explained, "and it is given only to those who have placed another's life above their own without hesitation or hope of reward." Yuna took the medallion with hands that trembled slightly, and she understood the significance of what she held. "No non-Corvani has ever received this honor." Threvok added, "I do not know what to say." "Say nothing," the ambassador replied, "and simply wear it as a reminder that you have earned the eternal gratitude of my people." Cerise appeared beside his father, bouncing with excitement that he was clearly trying to contain. "Now human Yuna is officially a guardian," he announced to anyone who would listen. "And that means she has to protect me forever." "I believe that was already understood," Threvok said with something approaching a smiley. Yuna looked around the room at the beings who had come to witness this moment, and she thought about how much had changed since she first met the Corvani delegation. She had been seen as weak and fragile and unimportant, and now she was being honored as a guardian and a hero, all because she had refused to stand by while a child suffered. Perhaps that was the true gift of humanity. She realized not the ability to exceed their physical limits, but the certainty that they would try, because in the end, that was what separated humans from so many other species in the galaxy. They did not calculate the odds before acting. They simply acted, and dealt with the consequences afterward. Cerise tugged at her sleeve, pulling her attention back to the present moment. "Human Yuna, will you teach me to be strong like you?" She knelt down to meet his eyes, the metal hanging warm against her chest. "I will teach you something better," she said. "I will teach you to be kind." The cub tilted his head with confusion. "Is kindness better than strength?" Yuna smiled and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Kindness is what gives strength meaning," she said, "and without it, all the power in the galaxy is worthless." Cerise considered this with the intensity he brought to every new idea, and then he nodded with the confidence of someone who had decided to believe. "Then I will be the kindest Corvani in the Empire," he declared. "I believe you will," Yuna said. And she meant every word above them. The stars wheeled in their eternal dance. And somewhere in the vast darkness of space, the story of the human who lifted the impossible weight was already spreading from world to world. It was not a story of war or conquest or technological triumph. It was simply a story of a woman who heard a child crying and refused to accept that she could not help, and in the end, that was the most human story of all. The days following the incident brought changes that Yuna had not expected. She had been confined to her quarters by medical order, her arms wrapped in regenerative bandages and her shoulder immobilized to allow proper healing. The station's human doctor visited twice daily to check her progress and lecture her about the damage she had done to herself. You understand that normal humans cannot lift 400 kilograms, the doctor said during one such visit. I am a normal human. Yuna replied, normal humans who lift 400 kilograms end up with injuries much worse than yours. I got lucky. The doctor made a sound of pure frustration and adjusted the settings on her regenerative wrap. What you got was a demonstration of hysterical strength that will probably end up in medical journals, she said. And the only reason you are not permanently crippled is because you somehow managed to maintain perfect form while doing something impossible. Yuna did not know how to respond to that, so she simply said nothing. The visitors began arriving on the second day. First came Counselor Maris of the Delvian delegation, their blue skin flushed with something that might have been embarrassment. I wish to apologize, they said, standing awkwardly in Yuna's doorway. For what? My people have always looked down on humans, Maris admitted. And we considered your species to be crude and primitive and not worthy of serious diplomatic attention. Yuna nodded slowly, waiting for them to continue. I was wrong, Maris said. And I believe my entire species has been wrong. And I wanted you to know that I will be recommending a complete reassessment of Delvian policy toward humanity. Because I lifted a couch? Because you destroyed your own body to save a child who was not your own species, Maris corrected gently. And in Delvian culture, that kind of sacrifice is considered the highest form of moral behavior. They bowed in the Delvian fashion, one hand pressed over their heart, and then they departed without another word. The next visitor was Vexus, the Morthani trader who had tried to help during the rescue. I have sent a report to my trading guild, they announced, settling their 6-limbed body onto a chair designed for beings with 4 limbs. About the couch incident? About humans in general, Vexus said, and specifically about the implications for interspecies commerce. Yuna raised an eyebrow at this, which sent a twinge of pain through muscles she had not realized were connected to her arms. You see, the Morthani have always assumed that humans were a species of limited value in galactic trade, Vexus explained. Because you have no natural weapons and no special biological capabilities that would give you advantage in negotiation or enforcement. And now? Now I understand that humans have something far more valuable than claws or venom. Vexus leaned forward with obvious interest. Your species can exceed its own physical limitations through sheer force of will, they said. And that is a capability that no amount of biological engineering has ever achieved in any other known species. We cannot do it all the time, Yuna pointed out. That makes it more impressive. Not less, Vexus departed with promises to return for a longer conversation about human trade potential. And Yuna was left alone again with her thoughts. The Perdetipe and most significant visitor came on the third day. Ambassador Threvok arrived without his guards, which was unusual enough to make Yuna sit up straighter despite her injuries. He stood in her doorway for a long moment before speaking. May I enter? Of course. The ambassador moved into the room with the same careful grace he always displayed. But there was something different in his bearing. Now some of the arrogance had faded. replaced by something more thoughtful. Cerise has not stopped talking about you, he said. Children form attachments quickly. It is not attachment, Srivak corrected. It is admiration, and in Kovani culture, a child's admiration is not given lightly. He settled onto a chair that creaked under his weight, and his amber eyes studied Yuna with an intensity that might have been uncomfortable in other circumstances. I have been trying to understand what you did, he said. And I have reviewed all available literature on human biology. What did you learn? That your species should not exist. Yuna laughed despite herself, and the motion pulled at her injured shoulder. That is not a conclusion I was expecting. You evolved on a world with higher gravity than most habitable planets, Trivak said. And you survived, despite having no natural defenses against predators. And you developed technology, despite having one of the shortest average lifespans of any sapient species. We are stubborn. Yuna agreed. You are more than stubborn. The ambassador leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something almost like reverence. The literature speaks of humans performing impossible feats to save others, he said. And I thought these were exaggerations meant to make your species seem more impressive. Some of them probably are, but some of them are not. No. Thrivik nodded slowly. Processing this confirmation, I have sent a report to my government, he said. And I have recommended a fundamental change in how the Kurvani Empire views humanity. What kind of change? We have always assumed that your species was beneath consideration as potential allies, Srevak explained. Because your military capabilities are limited, and your individual physical power is negligible. That is a fair assessment. It is a blind assessment, the ambassador corrected. Because it ignores the quality that makes your species truly dangerous. Yuna waited for him to continue. You do not give up, Thrivik said. And you do not accept limitations that others would consider absolute. And you will destroy yourselves to protect beings who are not even your own species. That sounds like a weakness more than a strength. It would be a weakness if it were predictable. Thrivik agreed. But it is not predictable, because even you do not know when you will exceed your own capabilities. He stood and began pacing the small room, his tail swishing with agitation. The Kovani have fought many wars, he said. And we have learned to assess our enemies based on their maximum capabilities. But how do you assess an enemy whose maximum capabilities are unknown even to themselves? You do not, Yuna said quietly. Exactly. Trivek stopped pacing and turned to face her directly. My recommendation to my government is that humanity should never be made an enemy of the Kurvani Empire, he said. Because we cannot predict what humans would be capable of if they felt their people were threatened. We would probably lose any war against you. Yuna said honestly, perhaps, but perhaps not, and that uncertainty is more valuable than any weapon. He moved toward the door, then paused. There is one other matter I wish to discuss. Yes? Cerise has requested permission to visit you during your recovery, Srivik said. And something complicated moved through his expression, and in Kovani culture, granting such permission would indicate that I trust you with my child's well-being. Yuna understood the weight of what he was offering. I would be honored to have his company. She said. Threvak nodded once, sharply, and then he was gone the next morning. Cerise arrived at her door with a small bag of gifts and an endless supply of questions. Human Yuna, why do your arms not work properly? Because I hurt them lifting the couch. Why did you hurt them? Because I lifted something too heavy. Why did you lift something too heavy? Because you needed help. Cerise considered this with the intensity of a young mind grappling with a new concept. Would you hurt yourself again to help me? Yuna looked at the cub with his shaved neck and his wide golden eyes and his absolute trust in her answer. Yes, she said. I would. Cerise nodded as if this confirmed something important. And then he reached into his bag and produced a small figurine carved from what looked like bone. I made this for you, he said. and father helped me carve it because I am not allowed to use sharp tools yet. The figurine showed a small being lifting something large. And though the proportions were off and the carving was rough, Yuna recognized it immediately. "It is me," she said. "It is a hero," Cerise corrected. "And father says heroes should be remembered." Yuna held the small carving in her damaged hands and felt something warm spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the regenerative therapy. The sound that came from Yuna was not quite a scream and not quite a roar, but something in between that made every being in the room freeze with shock. Her face had gone red, and her veins stood out against her skin like rivers on a map. And the tendons in her neck strained until they looked ready to snap. The couch rose. It rose only a few centimeters. Barely enough to notice, but those few centimeters were enough to release the tension on the floor bolts. "Now!" Yuna screamed, and the word tore from her throat like something a Leviathan moved faster than anyone had ever seen a Corvani move. His warrior instincts taking over where his conscious mind had failed. He grabbed the edge of the couch and pulled with all his considerable strength, and the weakened bolts gave way with a shriek of tortured metal. The couch slid away from the wall, revealing the gap where Cerise lay curled in the darkness. Yuna dropped to her knees as her strength gave out, and the couch crashed back down with a boom that echoed through the entire level. But it did not matter because Threvok was already behind where the couch had been. His massive arms reaching for his sunzers hung limp in the tangle of his own mane, his fur caught in a mess of exposed wiring that had somehow worked loose from the couch's internal frame. The cub's eyes were closed and his breathing was shallow. But he was breathing. Threvok's claws cut through the tangled fur with surgical precision, and in seconds he had freed his son from the trap. He pulled Cerise against his chest and held him there. And the great warrior ambassador of the Corvani Empire made a sound that no one in the room would ever speak of again. It was the sound of a father who had nearly lost everything. Yuna watched from where she had fallen, her arms hanging useless at her sides and her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could not feel her hands anymore, and there was something wrong with her shoulder that sent bolts of lightning through her body every time she moved. But Cerise was safe, and that was all that mattered. The cub stirred in his father's arms, and his golden eyes fluttered open. "Father?" he said, and his voice was thick with confusion. "I am here," Threvok said. "You are safe now." Cerise looked around the room at all the beings staring at him, and then his gaze landed on Yuna. "The human helped me," he said. "Yes," Threvok agreed, and his voice held something complex that Yuna was too exhausted to analyze. "The human helped you." Medical teams arrived in a rush of activity, and soon both Cerise and Yuna were being examined by doctors of various species. The cub had suffered no serious injury beyond some lost fur and a bruised arm, where the circulation had been restricted, and he was pronounced healthy within minutes. Yuna's diagnosis took longer. The human doctor who examined her made sounds of concern that grew more worried as the examination continued. "You have torn multiple muscles in both arms," the doctor said, reading from a scanner, "and you have partially dislocated your left shoulder and damaged the tendons in both wrists. Will it heal?" Yuna asked. "Eventually, but you will need significant recovery time and rehabilitation." Yuna nodded and immediately regretted the motion as pain shot through her shoulder. "Worth it," she said. The doctor looked at her with an expression that mixed admiration with exasperation. And then they began treating her injuries with a combination of medication and regenerative therapy throughout the treatment. Yuna was aware of Threvok, watching her from across the medical bay. The ambassador had not left his son's side since the rescue, but his eyes kept returning to the human who had done the impossible. When the doctors finally allowed Yuna to sit up, Threvok approached with Cerise walking beside him. The cub's neck had been shaved where his mane had been torn, and he looked younger without the developing growth of fur. "Human Yuna," Cerise said, and his voice was formal in a way that suggested he had been coached. "I thank you for saving me." "You are welcome," Una said. And she meant it completely. Thravak stood in silence for a long moment, and Una could see him struggling, with something pride and gratitude warred in his expression. And she waited patiently to see which would win. "I do not understand what you did," the ambassador finally said. "I lifted a couch." Una replied with a small smile that hurt her face. "That couch weighed more than you could possibly lift." "Yes." "And yet you lifted it." "Yes." Thrivak's whiskers twitched with frustration at her simple answers. "How?" he demanded. Una considered the question carefully, turning it over in her mind as she searched for words that would make sense to someone who had never been human. "Do you know what a predator is?" she asked. "Of course. My species evolved as apex predators on our world. Humans did not," Una said. "We evolved as something different." She shifted on the medical bed, wincing as her shoulder protested the movement. "On our world, we had no claws and no fangs and no armor, and we were surrounded by animals that could kill us easily in a fair fight." Srevak nodded slowly, and she could see him filing this information away. "So we learned to never fight fair," Una continued, "and we learned to hunt not with strength but with endurance, chasing our prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Persistence predators," the ambassador said, and his tone suggested he had heard the term before, but never truly understood it. "Yes, but that is only part of what we are." Una looked down at her damaged hands, at the evidence of what she had done. "Humans are also pack animals," she said, "and we take care of our pack, and when someone in our pack is threatened, something in our biology changes." "Changes how?" "Our brains normally limit how much strength our muscles can use," Una explained, "because using full strength would damage our bodies. But in moments of extreme need, those limits can be removed." Thrivak's eyes widened slightly as understanding began to dawn. "You damaged yourself to save my son." "I did. Deliberately." "Yes." The ambassador stared at her for a long moment, and she saw the warrior in him reassessing everything he thought he knew about her species. "But Cirrus is not part of your pack," he said finally. Una smiled despite the pain it caused. "He was a child in danger," she said. "And for humans, that is enough." Cirrus had been listening to this exchange with wide eyes, and now he tugged at his father's arm. "Father, does this mean humans are strong?" Thragok looked at his son, then at Una, then at the couch that still lay on its side across the room with its bolts torn from the floor. "It means," he said slowly, "that I have been wrong about humans for a very long time." He turned back to Una and did something that made every Corvani guard in the room gasp with shock. Ambassador Thrivak of the Corvani Empire lowered his head in a bow of respect to a human who weighed less than half what he did and stood a full half-meter shorter than him. "You have given me a debt I cannot repay," he said. "I do not want payment," Una replied. "I just want your son to be more careful around large furniture." Cerise giggled at that, a high chittering sound that was the Corvani equivalent of laughter, and even Thrivak's stern expression softened. "I will try," the cub promised. "That is all anyone can ask," Una said. The gap between the couch and the wall looked narrow, even for a cub. But Cerise had the flexible body of the young, and the determination of the curious. Una watched him slip into the darkness behind the massive furniture, and she heard his claws scraping against the floor as he reached for the shiny object. "Be careful," she called. But the warning came too late. A soft sound of surprise came from behind the couch, followed by a grunt of effort, and then silence. "Cerise?" Una asked, moving closer to the gap. "I'm stuck," the cub said, and his voice held the first tremor of fear. Una knelt down and tried to see into the darkness, but the couch was too massive and the gap too narrow for her to fit her head through. "Can you describe what happened?" "My mane caught on something," Ceres said, and now the fear was growing stronger. And when I try to pull back, it hurts. The Gorth couch had been built to support beings who weighed over 1,000 kilograms. And its internal frame was a complex structure of metal supports and reinforced joints, somewhere in that framework. The soft developing fur of the cub's mane had become tangled. Stay still, Una said, keeping her voice calm even as her mind raced through options. And I am going to get help. She pulled out her communication device and contacted the Diplomatic Compound's emergency line. Explaining the situation in quick, clear words, then she contacted Ambassador Threvok directly. Response was immediate. Within minutes, the common lounge had filled with beings of various species, all drawn by the commotion and the increasingly distressed sounds coming from behind the couch. Threvok arrived at a run, his ceremonial robes forgotten and his eyes wild with parental terror. "Ceres!" he called, dropping to his knees beside the couch. "Father, I cannot get free," the cub wailed, and his voice had risen to a high keening that made every parent in the room wince. Regardless of species, Threvok tried to reach behind the couch, but his arm was too thick with muscle to fit through the gap. Snarled in frustration and attempted to pull the couch away from the wall. But the furniture had been bolted to the floor to prevent accidents during station maneuvers. "We need to unbolt it," someone said. And a Morthani trader named Vexus pushed forward with a toolkit, but the bolts were underneath the couch, inaccessible without lifting the massive piece of furniture first, ready again to force his arm through the gap. And Ceres cried out as the movement jostled whatever held him trapped. "Stop," Una said sharply. "You are making it worse." The ambassador turned to her with fury in his eyes, but she held his gaze without flinching. "Every time you move the couch, it pulls at whatever has caught him," she explained. "And we need to be careful." A Delvian named Councillor Maris approached with evident reluctance, their blue skin pale with anxiety. "Perhaps I could reach him," they offered. "As my arms are quite slender," they tried. But Delvian joints did not bend in the right direction to navigate the gap, and they withdrew with an apology. The Morthani Vexus attempted next with 2 of their 6 arms. But the angle was wrong, and they could not reach far enough to find where the cub was caught. Ceres had stopped crying now, and his silence was somehow worse than the keening. "Little one, are you still there?" Threvok called, and his voice cracked on the words. "I am here." "Father," Ceres replied, but his voice was small and tired. "But I cannot feel my arm anymore." The cub's circulation was being cut off by his position, and everyone in the room understood what that meant. They were running out of time. "Can we cut through the couch?" asked a Veth diplomat who had climbed onto a table to see better. "The frame is reinforced titanium," Vexus said, checking the manufacturing specifications on a datapad. "And cutting through would take specialized equipment we do not have on this level." "Then we send for the equipment," Threvok demanded. "That will take at least 30 minutes. Councillor Maris said quietly. 30 minutes was too long. And everyone knew it. Una stood at the edge of the group, watching the scene unfold with a strange clarity that had settled over her mind. She looked at the couch and calculated its dimensions, looked at the gap and measured it against her own body, looked at the beings around her and assessed their capabilities. The Kavani were strong but too large. The Delvians were slender but too fragile. The Morthani had reach but not the right angles. And the Veth were simply too small to provide any leverage. But humans were different. Humans had evolved on a world that tried to kill them in 1,000 ways. And they had survived not through claws or venom or armored skin, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to die. Humans could push their bodies past the point of breaking when something important was at stake. Una moved forward, pushing past the gathered diplomats until she stood at the end of the couch opposite from where Ceres was trapped. "What are you doing?" Threvok asked. "I am going to lift the couch," Yuna said. The statement hung in the air for a moment before several beings laughed with disbelief. Human. That furniture weighs over 400 kilograms. Vexus said with something like pity in their voice. I know. You cannot possibly lift it. I know, Yuna said again. But I am going to try anyway. She positioned herself at the corner of the couch where the bolts connected to the floor. And she studied the structure with careful eyes, if she could lift it just enough to release the tension on those bolts. Even for a moment, it might create the space Thrivak needed to pull the couch away from the wall. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan she had. This is foolishness. Thrivak growled. Probably. Yuna agreed. But that is your son behind there. And I am not going to stand here and do nothing while he suffers. She crouched down and gripped the frame of the couch, feeling the cold metal against her palms behind her. Ceres made a small sound of pain that cut through every other thought in her mind. Yuna closed her eyes and remembered something her grandmother had told her long ago. A story about a woman who lifted a car to save her child. The doctors had said it was impossible, that human muscles could not generate that kind of force. But the woman had done it anyway because her child needed her hysterical strength, the scientists called it. And they still did not fully understand how it worked. All Yuna knew was that somewhere deep in human biology, there was a switch that could be flipped in moments of desperate need. A switch that turned off the safety limits the brain normally placed on the body. She thought about Ceres. Small and scared and hurting in the darkness, she thought about Thrivak. Proud and fierce but helpless to save his own child, she thought about what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of beings who were stronger and faster and more deadly than her species would ever be. And then Yuna Park stopped thinking altogether. She pulled. The couch did not move. She adjusted her grip and pulled again. And something in her shoulder screamed in protest. Still the couch did not move behind her. She heard Ceres whimper, and the sound reached something primal in her brain. Yuna took a breath that felt like fire in her lungs, and she stopped trying to lift the couch. Instead, she simply decided that the couch would rise. Her muscles tore and her joints ground against each other, and her vision went white at the edges. But the couch rose. The diplomatic station called Harmony Point floated in the darkness between 3 star systems, and it served as neutral ground for species who could not yet trust each other enough to meet on home soil. Yuna Park had lived on this station for 2 years now, working as a cultural attaché for the human delegation, and she had learned that first impressions between species rarely told the whole truth. She stood in the arrivals bay on a morning that felt like any other, watching the docking clamps secure a Corvani transport ship, and she took a slow breath to steady herself. The Corvani were new to galactic diplomacy, and they carried a reputation that made other species nervous. They stood over 2 meters tall with powerful bodies covered in short golden fur, and their faces resembled the great cats of Earth, but with sharper intelligence in their amber eyes. Their claws could tear through metal, and their warriors had conquered 3 systems before choosing to pursue peace instead of war. The airlock opened with a hiss of pressurized air, and Ambassador Thrivak stepped onto the station. He moved with the careful grace of a predator who knew his own strength, and his eyes swept the arrivals bay with assessment rather than curiosity. Behind him came 2 guards in ceremonial armor, and between them walked a small figure that made Yuna smile without meaning to. The cup could not have been more than 6 years old by human standards, and he looked at everything with wide golden eyes full of wonder. His mane had not yet grown in fully, leaving soft tufts of darker fur around his face and neck, and he clutched a small bag against his chest as if it held treasures beyond measure. Yuna stepped forward and offered the traditional Corvani greeting, crossing her arms over her chest with her palms facing outward to show she held no weapons. Ambassador Thrivak, I am Yuna Park, and I have been assigned to help your delegation settle into the compound. The ambassador studied her for a long moment, and she could see him cataloging her lack of claws, her flat teeth, her soft skin that would tear so easily under Corvani's strength. "You are the human," he said. "And it was not a question, I am," Una replied, keeping her voice warm and steady. "I was told your species would send someone more substantial." Una had heard variations of this comment many times before, and she no longer took offense at the observation. "I am what I am, Ambassador, and I hope to prove useful regardless of my size." The cub tugged at his father's ceremonial robe, and Thrivek looked down with an expression that softened just slightly. "This is my son, Cerise," the ambassador said, and there was pride beneath the formal tone. "He will remain with me during the negotiations." As is our custom, Cerise peered around his father's leg to look at Una, and his whiskers twitched with curiosity. "You have no fur," he said with the blunt honesty of children everywhere. "Cerise," Thrivek warned. But Una laughed. "You are right. I have no fur," she said, crouching down to meet the cub's eyes. "But I have something almost as good." She pushed up her sleeve to show the fine hair on her arm, and Cerise leaned closer to inspect it. "That is very small fur," he declared with disappointment. "Very small," Una agreed. "But it keeps me warm enough." Thrivek watched this exchange with an expression Una could not quite read, and then he gestured for her to lead the way. The walk to the diplomatic compound took them through the station's central corridor, and Una pointed out important locations along the way. She showed them the medical bay staffed by doctors from 12 different species, the marketplace where traders sold goods from across the galaxy, and the gardens where plants from 100 worlds grew under artificial sunlight. Cerise wanted to stop and examine everything, but his father kept him moving with gentle pressure on his shoulder. "The compound has been prepared for your species," Una explained as they walked, "with larger furniture and adjusted temperature controls. And the kitchen staff have studied Corvani dietary requirements. We brought our own food," Thrivek said. "Of course. But the offer stands if you ever wish for variety." They passed a group of Delvian diplomats in the corridor, and the slender blue-skinned beings pressed themselves against the wall to let the Corvani pass. Una noticed how they looked at Thrivek with barely hidden fear, and she noticed how Thrivek pretended not to see it. The diplomatic compound spread across an entire level of the station, with private quarters for each delegation arranged around a central common area. The common lounge held furniture designed to accommodate species of many sizes, from the tiny Veth, who stood barely half a meter tall, to the massive Gorath, who needed reinforced seating. A couch built for Barath visitors dominated one corner of the room, and Una saw Cerise eyeing it with interest. "Your quarters are this way," she said, leading them down a side corridor. The Corvani suite had been decorated in warm colors with soft lighting, and the beds were wide platforms covered in cushions rather than the enclosed sleeping pods some species prefer. Vak inspected each room with careful attention while Cerise bounced on one of the platforms. "This is acceptable," the ambassador said at last, which Una had learned was high praise from a Corvani. "I will leave you to rest," she said, "but please contact me if you need anything at all." She turned to go, but Cerise called out to her, "Human Una, what is that?" He was pointing at a small device on the wall, a simple environmental control panel that lets you change the temperature and lighting, Una explained. And she showed him how the buttons worked. Cerise pressed each one several times, making the lights dim and brighten and shift through different colors. And his delight was obvious even across species lines. "Cerise, stop bothering the human," Thrivek said. "He is no bother," Una said honestly. "And curiosity is a gift." Thrivek made a sound that might have been agreement or dismissal, and Una could not tell which she left to Corvani to settle in. But she thought about the cub's wonder as she walked back to her own quarters. There was something universal about children. She decided something that transcended fur and claws and the politics of empires. The next morning, Yuna returned to check on the delegation and found Trevak in a meeting with other ambassadors in one of the conference rooms. Cerise sat outside the door with one of the guards watching over him, and the cub looked profoundly bored. "Would you like a tour of the station?" Yuna offered, and Cerise perked up immediately. The guard looked uncertain, but Yuna smiled at him reassuringly. "I will keep him safe," she said, "and we will stay in the public areas." The guard consulted briefly with Ambassador Trevak through a communication device, and permission was granted with obvious reluctance. Cerise bounded to his feet and fell into step beside Yuna, his earlier boredom forgotten entirely. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Wherever you want," Yuna said, within reason. They walked through the station together, and Yuna answered the endless stream of questions that poured from the curious cub. He wanted to know why the lights flickered in one section and why a Morthani trader had so many arms and why humans walked on only 2 legs, when 4 would be more stable. Yuna answered each question with patience, and she found herself enjoying the cub's company more than she had expected. They ended up back at the common lounge, where Cerise spotted something that made his eyes go wide. Small reflective object had rolled beneath the massive Garth couch, catching the light and sending tiny rainbows dancing across the floor. "What is that?" Cerise breathed before Yuna could answer. The cub was already moving toward it, his curiosity overriding everything else. She watched him squeeze into the gap between the couch and the wall, and she felt the first flutter of concern in her chest.